I'm Claire Bennett, 33, and the night I walked up the stone steps of a Pacific Heights mansion in scuffed sneakers, I knew I was about to learn whether kindness could live under crystal chandeliers. The fog had slipped in from the bay and clung to the iron gate, softening the edges of a life that wasn't mine. In my tote was a small box of cookies wrapped in brown paper, a modest gift for people who believed in grand gestures. Beside me, Noah Whitman squeezed my hand like a man caught between two worlds. By the time the front door opened, I had already decided to let them see only what they wanted to see and to listen for what that would reveal. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to hold your head high when someone sized you up by your shoes. I didn't come from rooms like that. I grew up in Willow Creek, Oregon, where mornings smelled like sawdust from my dad's shop and chalk dust followed my mom home from her English classroom. We weren't wealthy, but the table was steady, the porch light warm, and my parents taught me that you looked a person in the eye before you looked at what they carried. When bills pinched, neighbors left eggs on doorsteps and no one kept count. Dignity, my mother said, wasn't a gift you gave. It was the way you chose to see someone. College stretched those lessons thin and made them stronger. A scholarship took me to Berkeley, and I learned to love small spaces and big ideas, library shifts, secondhand coats, walks across campus in the rain. My path into finance started at a wobbly desk in a cramped San Jose office where the coffee machine rattled louder than our ambitions. Years later, after audits that ran past midnight and deals that seemed impossible until they weren't, I became the chief financial officer at Summit Labs. The paycheck change, the habits didn't. I still biked to work from a one-bedroom near Valencia Street, still bought bread from the bakery, where they knew my name, still preferred silence to display. I met Noah on a gray Saturday when the city felt hushed and kind. He slid a napkin across a cafe table after I splashed coffee on a newspaper, and we laughed like two people surprised by the ease of it. He was thoughtful in the small ways that matter: an extra jacket when the wind turned to text when the fog rolled in, thick a quiet shoulder when the day had been long. Only later did I learn how hard he tried to be the son his parents expected: Linda, who could turn a fundraiser into a photograph spread, and Charles, who wore authority like a well-cut suit. When Noah joked that even their salad forks came with a resume, I heard the weariness under the humor. The distance between our worlds wasn't measured in miles. It was the way conversation curved around reputation, the way names opened doors, the way a last name could feel like a business card. I never told Noah the number on my paycheck, not because I wanted to play a game, but because I wanted him to know me without it. In rooms where logos and labels set the rules, I'd learned that silence could be a shield. I wanted to keep a place where worth was separate from wealth, where a long day could end with soup on the stove and the soft scrape of a bike against the hallway wall. When Noah asked me to have dinner with his parents, the invitation felt like a fork in the road. He was earnest and hopeful, and I could see how much he wanted it to go right. I thought about the houses I'd seen lit up on the hill, the stories he'd told about winter galas and summer auctions, the careful way he spoke about not embarrassing the family. I told him yes, then stood in front of my closet and chose a simple cotton dress from years ago, the one that fit like a memory. I tied my hair back, slipped on the worn sneakers that had carried me through long, honest days, and picked up a plain, paper-wrapped box. As the taxi turned toward the hill and the fog thinned to silver, I realized I wasn't walking into a test to win, I was walking into a room to listen. On the other side of that door, I would find out whether grace could stand where standards were the loudest. The evening fog settled low across the bay, drawing a pale curtain over the rooftops of Pacific Heights. Through the taxi window, the Whitman mansion rose from the haze like something out of another century: white pillars, glass balconies, lights glowing behind sheer curtains. The air smelled faintly of lavender and the sea. My hands rested on the small, paper-wrapped box of cookies in my lap, and for a brief second, I caught my reflection in the glass, a plain cotton dress hair pulled back, sneakers from my college days. The sight steadied me. This was exactly how I wanted them to see me. When the gate opened with a soft mechanical hum, I stepped out into the chilled air. A piano played somewhere inside, graceful and distant, like a memory that didn't belong to me. The door swung open before I could knock. Linda Whitman stood framed in the light of the entryway, tall and elegant in a cream blouse, her blonde hair curled just so. She smiled, polite, practiced, and her eyes moved over me with quiet precision before they settled on the cookies in my hands. "Oh, how thoughtful," she said lightly. "You baked?" I nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I hope you like almond." Her husband appeared a moment later, carrying the presence of someone used to being listened to. Charles Whitman had the kind of handshake that made a point firm, controlled, never warm. "Pleasure to meet you, Claire," he said. "Noah tells us you work in finance." "I do," I replied, "at a company called Summit Labs." He repeated the name slowly, as if searching for where to place it in his mental ledger. "Summit?" he murmured. "Interesting." His tone hung halfway between curiosity and dismissal. Noah joined us then, a little too cheerful, his hand brushing the small of my back. "Mom. Dad, this is Claire." His voice carried that edge of hope I'd come to recognize, the kind that belongs to someone trying to keep peace in a room that hasn't yet broken. Linda ushered us toward the living room where every surface gleamed. Crystal vases stood on marble tables. Art lined the walls in cool, abstract tones. Even the air seemed disciplined, perfumed with something floral and expensive. "Charles designed the space himself," she said proudly. "He has such an eye for balance." I smiled. "It's beautiful," I said, though the word felt too simple for a house so meticulously arranged to impress. Dinner was served in a room large enough for 20, though there were only 4 of us. A chandelier hung above the table, scattering light like cut glass. A quiet woman in a black dress appeared to pour wine, then vanished as silently as she'd come. The first course arrived beet salad with goat cheese arranged like a painting, and the conversation began with travel. "We just returned from Napa," Linda said, swirling her wine. "The spa suite was divine, $2,000 a night, but worth it. It's where Charles recharges his creativity." Her husband smiled modestly, pleased. "The condo there was a smart investment," he added, "already doubled in value." I nodded politely, murmuring something about timing and market confidence. They seemed to expect a different reaction, admiration perhaps, but I offered none. The conversation rolled on to art, to architecture, to friends who owned vineyards. Each story glimmered with the same undercurrent comfort, measured in cost. When Linda turned her attention to me, her tone softened, but her eyes did not. "You have such a simple style, Claire," she said, tilting her head with a hint of charm. "It's refreshing, really. These days everyone tries so hard to look accomplished." I met her gaze and smiled. "I just like being comfortable." Her lips curved in a polite half-smile. Across the table, Noah cleared his throat, changing the subject to a new software project at work. I could feel his tension, the way his knee bounced under the table, the quick glances he cast my way as if apologizing without words. But I stayed calm. I hadn't come here to win them over. I'd come to see them clearly. The next course arrived, salmon with truffle potatoes plated so perfectly it almost felt wrong to eat. Charles turned to me again. "So Claire, where do you live in the city?" "In the Mission District," I said. "I rent a small apartment near Valencia." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Ah, yes, that area is very artistic," he said. "Affordable, too, I hear." I smiled. "That's true. I like it because people there don't care much about status." Linda's laugh was soft but sharp around the edges. "How charming," she said. "When I was your age, I enjoyed that kind of freedom, too, until I realized stability is real happiness." Her tone made it clear that freedom was the same as inexperience. Noah shifted again, his fork scraping lightly against the plate. "The Mission's got great food, though," he said quickly. "Claire knows all the hidden spots." "I'm sure she does," Linda replied, her eyes never leaving mine. She refilled my water glass herself, a gesture that might have looked kind to anyone who didn't hear the echo behind it. "Would you like a glass of Cabernet?" she asked, lifting the bottle. "It's a 2010, quite rare." "Thank you," I said, "but I usually wait until I'm sure the bottle's worth it." For a heartbeat, silence slipped into the room. Then Linda laughed light and polished. How sensible. But I caught the flicker in her expression, the surprise of someone unaccustomed to being met halfway. The meal continued, each course more delicate than the last. Between bites, questions began to circle closer. "You mentioned you're in finance," Linda said, her voice almost casual. "What exactly do you do?" I set my fork down carefully. "Mostly budgeting and contracts," I said. "Office work, really. That must be difficult in San Francisco," she said, glancing toward her husband. "The cost of living there is outrageous. You must have to watch every dollar." "I manage fine," I said. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes softened into something that looked like pity. "I admire that," she said sweetly. "Not everyone can be content with so little. It takes humility." The word hung between us, dressed as praise but meant as something else. I felt Noah's gaze on me again, silently pleading for restraint. I simply smiled, folded my napkin, and said, "My mother used to say the same thing. Humility keeps your heart light." Linda blinked once, unsure if it was agreement or deflection. Charles chuckled, filling the pause. "Linda works with a lot of young women through her event company," he said. "She's always trying to mentor someone." "That's true," she said warmly. "Many of them just need a little push. If you ever do, Claire, we'd be happy to help." I raised my eyes. "Help?" "Well," she continued, "perhaps a small allowance for wardrobe or networking events. $500 a month, say. You'd look wonderful in something more polished. A woman like you deserves to shine." Noah froze his glass halfway to his lips. For a moment I wasn't sure I'd heard right. Then I smiled, steady and polite. "That's very kind, Mrs. Whitman, but I like my simple clothes. They remind me of where I come from." She tilted her head. "Of course, dear. I just think Noah should be with someone who fits comfortably into our circles. Appearances can open or close doors." The sentence landed softly, but carried the weight of a verdict. I could feel the blood beating in my ears, the quiet scrape of silverware, the hush of a house that had forgotten what sincerity sounded like. Noah set his glass down a little too hard. "Mom," he said under his breath. "Maybe we should, sweetheart," she interrupted gently. "You know, I only want what's best for you." Her smile returned flawless and unyielding. "Claire," she said, "you're a lovely girl, truly. But sometimes a good heart just isn't enough." I looked at her, then at the man beside me, the one whose silence trembled between guilt and habit. The chandelier light caught in my glass, scattering tiny sparks across the linen tablecloth. I took a breath, steady and deliberate. "You mentioned standards earlier," I said softly. "I'd like to hear more about those." Linda straightened in her chair, uncertain now whether she'd won or wandered into something else entirely. And as the quiet deepened, I knew the night was far from over. The real conversation, the one none of us had yet spoken, was only beginning. The room seemed to shrink after that question. Linda leaned back slightly in her chair, still smiling, but the warmth in it had cooled. Charles folded his hands on the table, studying me with the same measured focus I'd seen from senior partners across a negotiation table. Even the chandelier light felt colder, scattering thin reflections across the polished silverware. Noah's eyes flicked between us, uneasy, though he tried to keep his expression calm. "You mentioned standards," Linda said, her tone syrupy smooth. "We simply mean that in our family appearances matter. They reflect how much pride one takes in themselves and the people they're with." I took a sip of water, letting the glass steady me. "I see," I said softly. "So it's about presentation." "Exactly," Charles replied, nodding. "In our circles, that can be the difference between belonging and standing out for the wrong reasons." Linda tilted her head, pretending sympathy. "I'm sure you understand. We all start somewhere. I just believe you deserve a little help to polish what's already there." The silence that followed was sharper than any insult. I felt Noah shift beside me, his leg brushing mine under the table, a quiet plea not to say anything. I smiled gently. "I appreciate your concern," I said, "but I think I'm comfortable where I am." Linda's eyes softened into pity, the kind that made you feel small without a single cruel word. "That's very humble of you," she said sweetly. "Still, it's a shame to let potential go unseen. You have a lovely face, dear, and with the right presentation people would see that more clearly." I could feel the faint tremor in Noah's breathing as he stared down at his plate. Charles poured himself another glass of wine. "Don't take it personally," he said lightly. "Linda can be a bit direct. She just wants what's best for Noah. It's not easy growing up in the public eye, and his relationships often attract attention. His words were calm, but the meaning was precise. Attention could be good or bad, and I was already leaning toward the latter. You've done well for yourself, he continued. But relationships like this, they work best when both sides share the same footing. For a moment, I watched the chandelier crystals sway slightly in the warm air above the table. The faint ticking of a nearby clock filled the silence, and I could almost hear my mother's voice in memory, reminding me to let people show their colors before I decide how to respond. Linda smiled again, her tone soft but deliberate. It's nothing personal, Claire. We just want to be sure Noah's future is balanced. Marriage, after all, is about shared values and resources. Noah finally spoke, his voice tight. Mom, please. She turned to him not unkindly, but with the patience of someone who had rehearsed this dynamic for years. Sweetheart, you know I'm right. I just don't want you to make choices you'll regret later. Then her attention returned to me. You must understand, Claire. Families like ours have certain expectations. Her words landed quietly, but they cut deep. It wasn't anger I felt. It was the weight of recognition. I'd seen this before in corporate meetings when someone smiled while writing you off. I folded my napkin carefully on the table, keeping my movements calm. I do understand, I said. But expectations can say as much about those who hold them as the people they're aimed at. For a second, no one spoke. The sound of the housekeeper clearing dishes in the distance seemed louder than before. Linda's smile froze in place just slightly. Charles glanced at her, then back at me, studying the tone of the conversation like an attorney evaluating a case that had turned unexpectedly. Noah reached for his glass again, his hand trembling slightly. Linda's voice softened, though the tension beneath it had sharpened. You know, I think Noah admires your independence. It's sweet, really, but you'll find that in time, partnership means leaning on others. I nodded. I agree, I said. The trick is knowing when someone's offering support and when they're asking you to shrink. That was the moment the room fell truly quiet. Linda's lips parted, but no words came out. Across the table, Charles let out a faint cough, the kind that buys time to collect dignity. Noah lowered his eyes, a flush creeping up his neck. I felt the last bit of warmth leave the conversation. The plates were cleared, replaced by small porcelain dishes of crème brûlée. The crack of spoons against caramel should have sounded comforting. Instead, every sound felt too sharp. Linda smiled again, though the muscles in her face had grown tight. Claire, she said lightly, I must say you carry yourself well for someone who hasn't had much exposure to our world. Thank you, I said, my voice calm. Exposure teaches many things, but character well that starts long before anyone's watching. I could see her flinch just slightly before she recovered with another flawless smile. Charles leaned back, folding his napkin, the faintest look of approval flickering in his eyes, not admiration, but acknowledgement that I'd held my ground. When the plates were taken away, he rose, murmuring something about an early meeting, and left the room. That left the three of us, Linda at the head of the table, Noah beside me, and the silence that had grown too heavy to ignore. She placed her glass down carefully, her voice quieter now. Claire, I don't mean to make you uncomfortable, but I've seen how these things go. Sometimes love alone isn't enough. Her tone carried the softness of a warning. I met her eyes. Then I suppose it depends on what love means to the people in it. Noah's hand brushed mine under the table, faint but desperate. Maybe we should end the night here, he said quietly. Linda stood smoothing the front of her dress. Yes, perhaps that's best. She turned toward me with a small, polished smile. Thank you for joining us, Claire. I'm sure this evening has been enlightening. Her eyes flickered with something like finality before she left the room. Noah exhaled as soon as she was gone, the air leaving his chest in a rush. I'm sorry, he whispered. I didn't think it would be this bad. I reached for my bag, my movements slow and deliberate. It's all right, I said. They've shown me what I came to see. He frowned. What does that mean? I shook my head softly. Nothing yet. The house felt colder as we walked toward the front door. The polished floors reflected our shadows like glass. At the threshold, Linda appeared again, her voice smooth as silk. Claire, before you go, she said, I do hope you won't take any of this to heart. It's just that we hold our standards dearly. I nodded once. So do I. Outside, the night air met me like a wave. Fog drifted low over the street, wrapping the city in a pale silver hush. I could hear Noah behind me, his voice low and uncertain. "Claire, wait." I stopped, but didn't turn right away. He stepped beside me, hands in his pockets. "Please don't think I agree with them," he said. I didn't know how to stop it. "I know," I said softly, "but sometimes silence says more than words." His shoulders sagged, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The gate clicked open, and I stepped through, the sound echoing in the quiet street. Behind me, I could hear the faint music from the piano, starting again, soft, distant, and perfectly in tune. The walk back toward the waiting taxi felt longer than it should have. The mansion's lights glowed behind me, bright and cold against the fog. Inside, their dinner would continue their lives undisturbed. But as I reached for the car door, one thought lingered. I had seen enough to know exactly what they valued, and enough to realize what I couldn't pretend to be. As the driver pulled away, I glanced once more at the tall white house fading into the mist. Something inside me had shifted, quiet and certain. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be silence. The next morning, the fog still hung low over the city, curling between rooftops and blurring the skyline. I sat by the window of my apartment, a mug of coffee cooling between my hands, watching the light turn from gray to pale gold. The night before kept replaying in pieces the chandelier's reflection in my water glass, the quiet sting in Linda's voice, Noah's silence when I needed him to speak. I wasn't angry anymore, just awake in a new way. I'd spent years building a life that didn't depend on anyone's approval. Yet sitting in that house surrounded by people who measured worth in price tags, something inside me had shifted. It wasn't pride and it wasn't hurt. It was recognition. I had let them assume what they wanted because I wanted to see the truth, and now I had. That weekend, Noah called twice. The first time I didn't answer. The second time I did. His voice was careful, soft. "I know last night was rough," he said. "My parents can be hard to read." I could hear the hesitation in every word. "They're not bad people, Claire. They just—" He stopped, then tried again. "They don't understand what they can't measure." "I'm not angry," I told him. "I just needed to see how they really think." He exhaled, relieved that my tone wasn't sharp. "Can I see you? Maybe dinner?" I hesitated. The truth was, I didn't want to talk over food again. "Let's go for a walk instead," I said. "Golden Gate Park. Tomorrow." The following afternoon, the park was alive with the hum of weekend noise kids chasing each other near the fountain, a group of cyclists gliding past a musician playing slow jazz near the lake. We walked quietly at first, the gravel crunching under our shoes. When Noah finally spoke, his words came in short bursts. "They shouldn't have said those things. Mom, she doesn't realize how she sounds. She thinks she's helping." I looked ahead, the wind pulling strands of hair loose from my scarf. "Helping who?" He winced. "You know what I mean." "I do," I said softly. "And I know you love them, but you stood there while they offered me charity." He stopped walking. "I froze," he admitted. I didn't know what to say without making it worse. He looked at me, searching my face for forgiveness. "I wanted them to see what I see in you, but I didn't think I needed to tell them who you are. I thought your kindness would be enough." The honesty in his voice softened the space between us. "It's not about kindness," I said. "It's about respect. You can't teach it to someone who only recognizes their own reflection." He nodded, his shoulders sinking under the weight of understanding. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should have said something." We found a bench near the edge of the lake and sat watching ducks move across the water in slow, deliberate lines. The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was heavy with things unsaid. Finally, Noah spoke again. "You know, when I was a kid, my mom used to tell me not to play outside with the neighborhood kids because they weren't our crowd." He gave a humorless laugh. I thought it was normal then. I didn't realize how small that made the world. I listened without interrupting. "Last night," he went on, "when she said those things to you, it was like hearing every rule I'd grown up with all over again. And I hated that I recognized it. For a long moment we just sat there, the wind rippling across the surface of the lake. 'It's not too late to see it differently,' I said. He turned to me, his eyes tired but honest. "You think so, I do, but it means letting go of what makes them comfortable." He nodded slowly. "I can do that." I looked at him, seeing not the man from that polished dining room, but the one who once offered me a napkin in a quiet cafe, laughing at my spilled coffee. Then start by being honest with them and with yourself. The walk ended with a quiet promise, nothing dramatic. Just two people agreeing to face what they'd been avoiding. When he dropped me off, he didn't try to come upstairs. He just said, "I'll talk to them." That night, the city was still. I sat at my desk reviewing a quarterly report, but the numbers blurred together. Somewhere between rows of data and projections, my thoughts drifted back to that dining room. The soft clinking of glasses, the cold politeness, the way Linda had smiled when she said humble. The memory no longer stung, but it didn't fade either. It reminded me why I'd chosen to live simply not as an act of modesty, but as freedom from that world entirely. Sunday came clear and bright. I rode my bike across town early, the wind sharp against my face. The morning streets were half empty, sunlight glinting off the bay. Somewhere between the hum of the tires and the rhythm of my breath, a decision formed. If Linda and Charles wanted to measure worth by appearances, then I would show them something they couldn't categorize. Not revenge, just truth. That afternoon I called Noah. "Invite them to dinner," I said. "This Friday. My treat." There was a pause. "You're sure?" "Yes," I said. "I think it's time they see me clearly." When Friday came, I reserved a table at a small restaurant overlooking the water. Nothing extravagant, but elegant in its simplicity. The kind of place where conversation carried more weight than display. I arrived early, taking a seat by the window. When the Whitmans walked in, they looked slightly out of place. Linda wore pearls again, though her smile seemed more guarded this time. Charles greeted me with the same measured politeness. "Nice view," he said. "Peaceful." I smiled. "It's one of my favorite spots. I come here after long days at the office." Linda's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she said nothing. We ordered, and for a while the conversation stayed safe. Weather City traffic, a mutual acquaintance from one of Linda's events. Then she looked at me and asked Claire, "What exactly do you do again?" "Finance, wasn't it?" "Yes," I said. "I oversee the financial operations at Summit Labs." Her tone was mild, but I saw the flicker of curiosity. "That sounds important." "It keeps me busy," I replied. "I manage about $80 million in operating budgets each quarter." Charles's fork paused midway to his mouth. Linda blinked. "I see," she said finally. "That's quite a responsibility." I nodded. "It is. But I love what I do. Numbers don't care about appearances, they only care about balance." The silence that followed was long, and for the first time Linda's smile faltered. I leaned back, letting the truth sit between us without embellishment. "I live simply because I can," I added, "not because I have to." Across the table, Noah looked at me, pride and regret flickering in his expression. Linda's voice was quiet when she spoke again. "I think I misjudged you." Her words were soft, but sincere, the kind that cost something to say. Charles cleared his throat and nodded slightly. "We all do sometimes." I smiled faintly. "It happens." Then I reached into my bag, pulled out a silver company card, and set it beside the check that had just arrived. "Dinner's on me," I said gently. "Consider it a thank you for showing me what really matters." Linda looked down at the card, her hands still for the first time that evening. "Claire, that's not necessary." "Maybe not," I said. "But it feels right." When we stepped outside, the sky was deep blue, the first stars faint above the water. Noah walked beside me in silence. After a moment, he said quietly, "You didn't have to prove anything." "I know," I said. "I just wanted to tell the truth in my own way." He stopped, turning to face me under the soft glow of the streetlight. "What happens now?" I met his eyes. "That depends on what kind of man you want to be." We stood there the night stretching out between us, calm and endless. Then he nodded, slow and certain. "I guess I'll find out." As I watched him walk back toward his parents, I felt no anger, no triumph, just quiet understanding. Some lessons needed light to be seen, and that night we had all stepped into it. The next morning, the fog returned soft and familiar. I opened the window and let it drift in the city humming below. Something told me the story wasn't over yet, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what came next. The days after that dinner passed quietly, though nothing about the silence felt simple. San Francisco moved at its usual rhythm, cable cars rattling down Market Street, the scent of roasted coffee drifting from open cafes. But I noticed everything differently. Conversations at work blurred into background noise, numbers on spreadsheets lost their usual precision. The night at the restaurant had drawn a line through my life, neat and final, and I couldn't yet tell what stood on either side of it. 3 mornings later, my phone rang while I was finishing a report. Noah's name appeared on the screen. I hesitated, then answered. His voice was rough, tired. "Claire," he said quietly, "I talked to them." The pause that followed carried more weight than his words. "They know they were wrong. My mom, she's been quiet since that night. Dad hasn't said much, but he's thinking. I can tell." I listened without interrupting. "I'm not looking for an apology," I said softly, "only understanding." "That's what I told them," he replied. And for the first time they didn't argue. By the end of the call, he asked to see me again. "Just to talk," he said. I agreed, not because I had answers, but because I wanted to hear what he had learned in the silence that followed truth. The next afternoon we met at a small cafe near Golden Gate Park. The air smelled of fresh bread and rain. He looked different, less polished, more human. His usual crisp jacket was gone, replaced by a simple gray sweater. When he sat across from me, he didn't start with excuses. "I didn't stand up for you when I should have," he said. "I thought staying quiet would keep things calm, but all it did was make the noise louder." I looked out the window, the glass fogging slightly from the steam of our coffee. "You were raised to believe silence keeps peace," I said. "But peace built on silence never lasts." He nodded. "After you left, my mom cried. She told me she'd never seen me so angry. I told her I was angry because she treated you like a problem to fix instead of a person to know." He took a deep breath. She didn't have an answer for that. We sat in that small space for nearly an hour, the sound of passing footsteps and clinking cups filling the pauses between us. There was no anger now, only honesty, the kind that leaves room for both people to breathe. When we finally stood to leave, Noah touched my arm gently. "I don't know if you can forgive me," he said, "but I want to do better. I want to be the kind of man who doesn't need you to prove your worth to anyone." I didn't respond right away. The wind outside pressed cool against my face as we stepped onto the sidewalk. "Then start by being that man," I said quietly. That evening, I returned home and opened the window to let the city air in. Lights from the Mission flickered across the street, soft and golden. I thought of my parents' small house back in Oregon, of my mother's words, about dignity being something no one can hand you, you have to carry it yourself. I realized I had been doing exactly that all along, even when others didn't see it. 2 days later, just as I was leaving the office, I received a call I never expected. The voice on the other end was measured but nervous. "Claire." "This is Linda Whitman." For a moment I said nothing. She continued, her tone softer now. "I'd like to see you, if you're willing. No agenda, just to talk." I hesitated, unsure what to make of it. But something in her voice, perhaps the unguarded tremor, made me say yes. She arrived the next morning at my apartment carrying a small basket of fruit and wearing a pale gray coat that looked less like armor than usual. When I opened the door, she smiled faintly. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "I just wanted to apologize in person." I stepped aside, motioning her in. The warmth of the room seemed to catch her off guard. She looked around slowly, her gaze settling on the framed photograph of my parents beside the bookshelf. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "Simple, but peaceful." I poured tea, and for a few moments we sat in quiet that felt almost fragile. Then she spoke again, her voice steady but low. "I was wrong that night. I thought I was protecting my son's future, but really I was protecting my pride. I've lived my life believing appearances could keep the world in order, but all they did was make it smaller." Her words surprised me with their clarity. I listened as she went on. "I realized that what you said about standards, it wasn't an insult. It was the truth. Respect doesn't come from who you invite to dinner. It comes from how you treat them when they walk through the door. The quiet stretched between us until I spoke. It takes courage to see that. She smiled faintly. It took you standing up to me to make me see it. And I want to thank you for that. We talked for nearly an hour. She told me about her upbringing, how she'd been taught that success meant control, that if you looked perfect, no one could hurt you. I told her about my parents, how they never had much but always left an extra chair at the table just in case someone needed it. The distance between our worlds began to feel smaller with every sentence. When she stood to leave, she paused by the door. "There's a charity run this Sunday that raises money for community schools," I said suddenly. "No cameras, no sponsors, just volunteers. You should come." Linda looked at me surprised. Then she nodded slowly. "I'd like that." Sunday morning arrived cool and bright. She showed up right on time, dressed in plain running clothes and a baseball cap. We pinned our numbers to our shirts and joined the small crowd gathered at the starting line. The air smelled of damp grass and coffee from a nearby food truck. As we jogged through the park, she laughed lightly out of breath. "First time I've done something like this without a donor's logo," she said. I laughed too. It feels different when it's just about the cause. When we finished, we sat on the grass with cups of hot coffee watching families and runners gather in small clusters. The sound of laughter carried across the park, soft and real. Linda looked around, her expression thoughtful. "I think I forgot what this feels like," she said quietly. "Doing something that doesn't have to be seen to matter." I nodded, the sunlight glinting through the trees. Sometimes that's where life begins again. She turned to me, her eyes warmer than I'd ever seen them. "Thank you," she said, "for forgiving me, for reminding me what's important." I smiled. We all forget sometimes. What matters is remembering. When she left later that morning, she hugged me briefly, a gesture small but genuine. Watching her walk away, I felt the last trace of anger fade into something gentler, something closer to peace. That evening, Noah called. "She told me about the run," he said. "She hasn't stopped talking about it. She said you reminded her of who she wanted to be when she was young." His voice caught slightly. "Thank you for that." I stood by the window again, the city lights shimmering like scattered stars. "Maybe we all just need someone to remind us of who we are," I said. Outside, the fog rolled in from the bay, slow and familiar. It brushed against the glass, soft as breath, as if the city itself was exhaling. I knew then that the hard part was behind me, but the story in its quiet way was still unfolding. The weeks that followed carried a kind of stillness I hadn't known before. The sharp edges of that old tension had softened, replaced by quiet understanding. Linda called once every few days, not out of obligation, but with a warmth that felt new, short conversations about ordinary things, a recipe she'd tried, a book she'd found at a second-hand shop. There was no trace of pretense in her voice anymore, no guarded polish. Sometimes Noah joined the calls, and for the first time his family felt like something real, not a performance. Work filled my days again, but in a steadier way. The end of the fiscal quarter meant long hours and late nights, yet I found myself breathing differently through it. At the office, the clatter of keyboards and the low hum of conversation reminded me how far I'd come. I wasn't the woman who needed to prove her worth at anyone's table anymore. One Friday afternoon, as the sun stretched across the city, my assistant knocked softly on my door. "Someone dropped this off for you," she said, setting a small envelope on my desk. Inside was a note in Linda's handwriting. "Dinner our home Sunday at 7. No formality, no surprises, just us." The words were simple, but they carried weight. I hadn't been back to that house since the night everything changed. For a moment, I considered saying no. Then I thought about the conversation we'd had after the charity run, the way she'd looked at the families playing in the park, and I realized I wanted to see where this new path would lead. Sunday evening came bright and cool. The mansion looked softer now, less imposing than I remembered. The garden lights glowed against the ivy-covered walls, and through the windows I could see movement in the kitchen, Linda arranging plates, Noah helping at the stove. The sight was disarming in its simplicity. When I stepped inside, Linda greeted me at the door without the careful posture she once held. She wore jeans, a soft blue sweater, and no jewelry except a thin gold band. "I'm glad you came," she said, her smile unforced. "Dinner's almost ready." The dining table, usually set for 12, was trimmed down to 4 places. There were no crystal goblets or towering candles, just simple plates, linen napkins, and a vase of tulips from the yard. The scent of roasted vegetables and lemon thyme filled the air. For the first time in that house, I felt at ease. Charles entered from the kitchen carrying a tray of bread. His usual precision was still there, but his tone was gentler. "Good evening, Claire," he said. "It's nice to have you back." "It's nice to be here," I replied. Dinner began quietly. Conversation found its rhythm through ordinary things: work projects, a new cafe opening in the city, Linda's growing interest in volunteering. Halfway through the meal, she paused, folding her napkin. "There's something I wanted to show you," she said. She stood and disappeared into the next room, returning with a small envelope. "I made a donation to that education fund. You mentioned the one that helps women return to school after layoffs. It's in your name." The words caught me off guard. "Linda, you didn't have to. I wanted to," she said quickly. "It reminded me of something you said, that value isn't about how you look, but what you give." Charles nodded beside her. "She's been saying that a lot lately," he added with a faint smile. "It's been a good influence on both of us." The moment was quiet, unpolished, and deeply human. There was no need for grand apologies or speeches. The gesture spoke louder than any of that could. After dinner, we moved to the patio. The air was crisp, the night sky brushed with faint stars. Linda poured tea while Noah leaned against the railing, the glow of the house soft behind him. "You changed this family," he said quietly, looking at me. "More than you know." I shook my head. "People don't change unless they want to," maybe he said, "but sometimes they just need someone to show them it's possible." Linda sat down beside me. "He's right," she said. "You gave us that. I used to think strength meant control. Now I see it looks a lot more like grace." Her words settled between us, light but steady. For a long moment we just sat there, listening to the wind move through the trees. When it was time to leave, Linda walked me to the door. "There's one more thing," she said, handing me a small box tied with twine. "Open it when you get home." Later that night, I untied the string and lifted the lid. Inside was a single fountain pen, the kind used for signing contracts or letters meant to last. Beneath it was a note written in neat handwriting. "You once said respect can't be bought. You were right, but it can be earned one honest moment at a time." I set the note down and turned the pen in my hand. It was simple, elegant, and perfectly balanced, much like the peace that had finally settled inside me. The next morning, sunlight spilled across my desk at work. My phone buzzed with a message from Noah Dinner again. "Next week, Mom's making her lasagna. Says she owes you the recipe." I smiled, typing a quick reply. Wouldn't miss it. Later that afternoon, as I looked out at the skyline, I thought of the long road that had led here, the first dinner, the quiet humiliation, the steady climb toward truth. What began as an act of patience had become something else entirely understanding, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken to be felt. Still, I knew the story wasn't finished. Change is never a single event. It's a series of choices that keep unfolding. And deep down, I sensed one more turning point was coming, something that would test what we had all learned. Outside, clouds began to gather over the bay, their edges lit gold by the setting sun. The city lights flickered to life one by one, as if reminding me that even in the dimmest hours, there's always a way forward waiting to be seen. The following months brought a kind of peace I hadn't known before. Life began to feel balanced again, steady days at the office, quiet evenings at home and weekends that no longer carried the weight of proving myself. The Whitmans had changed not in grand ways, but in the subtle ones that matter most. Linda's voice on the phone carried ease instead of pretense. Charles had grown quieter, less formal, often asking questions that came from genuine curiosity rather than obligation. And Noah, he seemed lighter, as though shedding years of old expectations had made space for something simpler and truer. One afternoon in late spring, he called while I was finishing a meeting. "Mom wants to invite you and your parents over," he said. "She wants to meet them properly this time." The words made me pause. My parents hadn't visited the city in nearly 2 years, and I knew they still pictured the Whitmans as a kind of polished royalty, beautiful but distant. "I'll ask them," I said. That evening I called home. My mother's voice brightened at the sound of mine, but I could hear the hesitation when I told her about the invitation. "Claire, are you sure?" she asked gently. "We don't want to embarrass you." I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. "You won't," I said. "It's time they met the people who made me who I am." That Sunday, the Whitman home looked different from the last time my parents had seen it from photos I'd shown them years ago. Gone were the endless floral arrangements and silver trays. The long dining table had been replaced with a round one set simply with white china and tulips, like the night Linda and I had reconciled. When my parents arrived, I saw my mother smooth her skirt and my father glance at the ceiling moldings in quiet awe. Linda greeted them at the door with a warmth that was entirely unforced. "Mary and Evan," she said, using their first names as though they were old friends. "It's so wonderful to finally meet you." My mother's smile was tentative at first, but Linda's sincerity melted the tension almost immediately. "Thank you for having us," my father said, shaking Charles's hand firmly. "Your home is beautiful." Charles smiled modestly. "We've been simplifying things," he said. "Linda's been teaching me that comfort matters more than display." My father chuckled softly. "That's a lesson my wife's been teaching me for 30 years. The two men exchanged a knowing grin, and I felt the first hint of relief settle in my chest. Dinner was simple roast chicken vegetables and my mother's favorite wine, which Linda had somehow remembered from a passing mention months before. Conversation flowed easily, circling between family stories, work, and the kind of laughter that builds bridges faster than apology ever could. When Linda asked my parents about their life in Oregon, my mother's eyes lit up. "We've got a small garden," she said. "He built the deck himself last summer, carpentry." Charles asked, leaning forward. "That's something I've always admired." My father laughed. "It's more patience than talent. Wood teaches you to slow down or you'll ruin the grain." Charles nodded thoughtfully, as if the words held a meaning beyond craft. Later after dessert, Linda turned to my mother and said, "I owe you a thank you." My mother looked puzzled. "For what?" "For raising a daughter who sees people for who they are, not what they have," Linda said softly. "I forgot how rare that is." My mother reached across the table, touched her hand, and said simply, "She's always been that way." The moment was quiet, but it filled the room more than any speech could have. Noah reached for my hand under the table, his thumb tracing a slow line across my palm. I didn't need to look at him to know what he was thinking. We had both come full circle. After dinner, we moved to the garden. The evening air was cool, the scent of jasmine threading through the space between us. My father walked with Charles toward the hedge, pointing at the woodwork on the deck railing. "You've got good craftsmanship here," he said. Charles smiled, half amused. "It's mostly thanks to a contractor," he admitted, "but I'd like to learn someday." Inside, my mother and Linda stood near the window, their voices low but kind. When I caught a fragment of their conversation, it made me smile. "Money changes many things," my mother said gently, "but kindness shouldn't be one of them." Linda nodded. "I'm still learning that." As the evening drew to a close, I walked my parents to their car. My mother hugged me tightly, her voice soft against my shoulder. "You've done well, Claire. You didn't just find your place, you made one." My father nodded, eyes warm. "They're good people," he said. "It takes time to see it sometimes, but they're trying." When I turned back toward the house, I saw Linda standing by the doorway watching. The porch light cast a halo around her, and for a brief moment she looked years younger, less like the woman who once measured life by appearances, more like someone who'd learned to breathe. She walked toward me, her hands folded loosely in front of her. "Thank you for tonight," she said, "for trusting me enough to bring them here." "It meant a lot to them," I said. "To all of us." She nodded. "I wasn't sure if I could make it right, but you made it easier than I deserved." I met her eyes, steady and kind. "Sometimes it's not about deserving," I said quietly. "It's about doing the right thing when you finally see how." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The city beyond the garden was quiet, the hum of traffic muted under the stars. Then she smiled a small, unguarded expression. "You're the daughter I didn't know I needed," she said. The words caught me off guard, but I understood what she meant. Families aren't always born from blood, they're built from the moments when pride gives way to understanding. I squeezed her hand lightly. And you're proof that it's never too late to change. As I drove home that night, the lights of the bay shimmered on the horizon. The air smelled of salt and spring rain, and somewhere between those quiet miles, I realized that peace doesn't always arrive with a grand ending. Sometimes it comes in small, steady ways, in shared laughter, in mended fences, in people choosing to meet halfway. When I reached my apartment, the pen Linda had given me still sat on the desk, gleaming softly under the lamp. I picked it up and turned it in my fingers, thinking about how much had shifted since that first dinner, the one where silence had been mistaken for grace. I opened my journal and began to write, not about work or goals, but about gratitude for the lessons learned, for the bridges rebuilt, and for the strength it took to let go of resentment. Outside, the fog began to drift in again, quiet and familiar. I knew that the hardest chapters were behind us, but one final one remained, the one where all of this would find its meaning. A few months later, the world settled into a calm rhythm again, but it felt new, somehow clean, like the air after rain. Work was thriving. My parents were happy in Oregon, and my days moved with quiet purpose. I'd stopped carrying that invisible weight of trying to prove who I was to people who couldn't see it. Now every decision came from peace instead of pride. One afternoon, while reviewing year-end projections at the office, I received a message from Linda. She and Charles were hosting a small fundraiser downtown, not the usual kind with champagne towers and silent auctions, but one focused on mentorship for young women entering finance and tech. She wanted me to speak. For a moment, I just stared at the message, remembering that first dinner, the sharp quiet of judgment hanging in the air. Then I smiled and typed back, "Of course. I'd be honored." The event took place in an old art gallery that had been turned into a community space. Exposed brick walls, low lights, soft jazz playing from a corner. Nothing about it felt ostentatious. The room was filled with students, small business owners, and families who had built their lives from the ground up. When Linda introduced me, her voice was steady and proud. "Claire Bennett taught me that success means nothing if it doesn't lift others," she said. "And that grace can be the most powerful form of strength." As I stepped up to the microphone, I caught Noah's eyes in the crowd. He nodded once, smiling in that quiet way of his, and the words came easily. I spoke about beginnings, how mine had been simple, how my parents taught me that kindness is the first form of intelligence, and how I learned sometimes the hardest way that self-worth doesn't need an audience. When the room rose to applaud, I didn't see admiration in their faces. I saw understanding. Afterward, Linda found me near the back of the room. "You were wonderful," she said, her eyes shining. "You made people feel something real." Charles joined us holding 2 cups of coffee. "You've given this family more than perspective, Claire," he said. "You gave us direction." His voice was quiet but sincere. I looked at them both and realized that the distance we once stood across had disappeared entirely. That night, Noah and I walked along the waterfront. The city lights shimmered across the bay, and a cool breeze carried the faint scent of salt and jasmine. "You know," he said, slipping his hands into his pockets, "Mom's been talking about stepping back from her company. She wants to focus on community projects." I smiled. "That sounds like her." "And Dad's thinking of teaching part-time at the law school," he added. "Says he wants to help people who don't have connections." We stopped at the edge of the pier. The water moved gently beneath us, reflecting the moonlight. "You changed them," Noah said softly. "All of us." I shook my head. "No," I said. "They changed because they wanted to. I just reminded them what mattered." He took my hand, his thumb brushing over my ring finger as if weighing something unspoken. Then he smiled, small and certain. "I think we're ready for what's next." In the weeks that followed, the mentorship fund Linda started grew faster than any of us expected. I joined as a board advisor, helping design programs for first-generation women in finance. The first group of scholarship recipients visited our office one Friday morning, their eyes bright with possibility. Watching them step into that boardroom reminded me of my younger self, the girl who used to study late into the night, determined to carve her own path even when no one believed she could. When I returned home that evening, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a handwritten note from Linda, sealed with a wax stamp. It read, "For every door that once closed, you've opened 10 more for others. Thank you for reminding us all that the best wealth is character." Tucked inside was the same pen she'd given me months ago, refilled and polished, ready to be used again. I placed it on my desk and stood by the window for a long time, watching the fog roll over the bay. Life had come full circle. What began as an act of endurance had become a story about connection, forgiveness, and the quiet courage of being yourself in a world that often asks you to be smaller. Somewhere beyond the glass, the city lights blurred into gold. I thought of my parents in Oregon, of Linda and Charles rebuilding what truly mattered, of Noah, and the life we were slowly building, not one defined by wealth or status, but by peace. People sometimes ask me what changed everything. The truth is, nothing miraculous happened. I simply stopped waiting for validation and started living from truth. And in doing that, the world around me began to shift, one heart at a time. If you've ever felt unseen, I hope my story reminds you that your worth doesn't depend on who recognizes it. Sometimes the quietest strength is the one that stands its ground without needing to shout. And before you go, take a moment to think about someone who once made you doubt yourself, then thank the lesson and let it go. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs that reminder tonight.